Hey everybody, this is Jen Kleinhans,
And I'm Rob Vose.
and you're listening to another episode of Everybody Hates Your Brand, a podcast where we talk about our thoughts and opinions on marketing, from customer experience to brand and everything in between. Join us today as we talk to Chris Bland, director of Walnut Unlimited, the human understanding agency.
So yeah, this interview, just a little warning up front before we launch into it. The sound quality on Chris's sort of audio is a bit iffy. There's some popping on the mic. We've tried to mitigate that as best we can, but just a friendly warning up front. So one of the things we like to do with our interviews is introduce experts in marketing disciplines in which we aren't experts, essentially. And one of those areas is market research. A sort of discipline that's going through some interesting changes on the back of behavioural science and neuroscience and a whole bunch of other interesting topics. So to enlighten us further in that area, we have an expert, as I said, a chap called Chris Bland, who is director at Walnut Unlimited. They describe themselves as the human understanding agency, and we've now found out that Walnut is called Walnut because it looks like a human brain. So nice to know that. Anyway, Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
No worries. At the beginning of every interview, we do what we call like a cred section. You know, it's the equivalent of those agency slides where you've got all the logos on for the brands that you work for. Do you just want to give a bit of background into you and your career and into Walnut Unlimited and what you're currently doing, please?
Sure, of course. So my background is, as you mentioned, I'm a director at Walnut, but I suppose I started out in quite the traditional quant route. So I started out at a big agency and worked my way through many kind of big trackers over the years, and often found myself on the receiving end of client questions saying, why is that data done that? Why is that data gone that way?
Mm-hmm.
So actually over those years, I've kind of become more interested in a lot of the kind of the behavioral science or the wider techniques, kind of blending in qual and quant together. And I've kind of ended up kind of going on that journey where actually my current role means that, you know, I'm working with a lot of really interesting kind of global clients as well as UK clients, but very much trying to blend together all the quant, the qual, and bringing in the data science, the analytics, behavioral science, and the neuroscience all together, which can be quite a challenge sometimes, but actually, you know, it does make for some kind of fascinating conversations and some really interesting kind of projects over the years. So, you know, I've been very lucky to work on a whole variety of topics from our time a few years ago when you were my client, you know, when we were interviewing all the gamers with Zelda tattoos for the new royalty schemes.
Yes, I'll never forget that. And the names of our segments, Cyberlords and Golden Pested Parents and a bunch of different other fun titles. Yeah, that was a good time. It feels like a long time ago now.
I think it was a very long time ago. And I think, you know, since then, you know, I've been lucky enough to kind of work on a whole variety of stuff, you know, from kind of helping launch new TV channels, testing comms, to finding, you know, what great theme park experiences are around the world, to all the exciting world of, you know, understanding mobile phone contract churn.
Well, thank you for that. I'd say that the kind of landscape of market research is changing a little. I think those elements you talked about, the data science, neuroscience, behavioral science, how all those play in. What are the biggest mistakes that you see brands making, both when deciding to, quote unquote, deploy market research, but also when they get it? What are the things that you see that you would, if you could put out a plea to say, please don't do that anymore? What would those things be?
I think it's a very good question, and it's one of those that, I mean, is quite difficult to answer in some ways, because, you know, every client comes at everything from slightly different angles. But I mean, there are some common themes that we do see, and that, you know, I'll often still find some briefs occasionally that clients are almost looking to prove kind of what they want to hear rather than genuinely trying to explore things and kind of understand. So I think, you know, we're still caught by, you know, some research is done for the sake of kind of just reinforcing what kind of clients want to hear in some of that way. But I think one of the biggest challenges we often come across, particularly, you know, when we're trying to talk about kind of new ways of doing things and capturing insights, I think, you know, we still see that, you know, the industry, it feels like a lot of brands are kind of, you know, held accountable by the CFOs have more of a say on research than the CMO. So actually, we can do a lot of exciting things with all the tools and technology these days, but a lot of clients will have very fixed budgets. So actually, it limits what they can do to stick to kind of what they already know, or kind of quite traditional routes in some ways. So one of my jobs is clearly to kind of showcase the value of some of those benefits, but I think it's often a shame, because sometimes the great insights come from being able to experiment and try some of these new things, and that isn't always possible if the CFO is kind of looking over the research shoulder.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I've been in that place a few times. I can understand what you mean. That bit about proving yourself right is a flaw, obviously, regardless of what you're doing from an experimentation perspective. Do you see that? So when people get results back and it contradicts what they think, do you see the kind of confirmation bias kick in? And if so, how do you kind of how do you try and get around that situation?
Yeah, and again, it kind of varies. I mean, obviously, when you're kind of dealing with a vast array of clients, you'll get everyone looking at it from kind of very different perspectives of their kind of role and their functions within those organizations. And I think, sometimes people do look to the research and want to find the answer they're looking for. And if they don't see that, then they try and shut that down. And that's often the challenge, that, there's a reason we have to do things robustly. There's a reason that we deploy a lot of these techniques to kind of go deeper into those kind of areas to kind of prove like what people actually are kind of saying and what they will do. I think one of the challenges we have as research as a whole is, what people say often doesn't reflect what they will actually do in the real world. So it can be kind of, you can get clients that will then go, well, actually, what you're saying there doesn't quite reflect the reality of what they're seeing. And that's why we've got to be really careful. And that's why we've got to kind of provide robust solutions, but also kind of take clients on that journey to say, well, actually, this is what the data is saying, but this is kind of the interpretation, and how do you workshop the solutions? How do you come up with new ways of doing that? And that's where, you can bring in some more of the kind of behavioral science to almost challenge clients back of their own confirmation bias, and actually kind of reframe some of that thinking to say, well, are there other ways of doing it? So I think, we come across that, but it's always makes for interesting conversations in that sense.
So obviously, classic research techniques. You've got your qual, you've got quant, focus groups, surveys, that kind of stuff. In terms of what we've learned about behavioral science and what we understand, as you said yourself, there's that great David Ogilvy quote, isn't it? I had to write it down. The problem is that people don't think how they feel, they don't say what they think, and they don't do what they say. And the idea of behavioral science and how that's affected market research and research techniques. Can you kind of talk a little bit more about both how that behavioral science has affected it, but also where you're going now in terms of neuroscience?
Yeah, so with behavioral science, it's one of those, it feels like it's one of those buzzwords that's been around for a while, but actually we're kind of at a point now where I think clients and agencies are truly starting to understand the potential and the power of the kind of the different nudges and where they can fit in. I think it is fascinating because we're aware of the kind of limitations of kind of humans in terms of our own memories, and yet we still do a lot of surveys where we'll go and ask people of what did they do last month, what did they do last week, and most time people won't remember the micro detail of a lot of their behaviors. So it's not just about behavioral science, it's also about kind of tracking behavior and capturing real world kind of behavior at source as well. So but behavioral science is one of those that feels like actually it's starting to turn a corner, that clients are interested to understand more about how to apply it. And actually, they know that there's a lot of things that can nudge consumers at a subconscious level. So, actually, being able to kind of use that in comms and designing experiences can actually open up a lot more kind of interesting ways and more effective kind of communication channels as well. So, we're seeing that kind of being applied from a number of different angles. I mean, we look at that. We run workshops for our clients to teach them about the principles of how it works and the science behind it. We ran one recently to teach a client of how to say sorry to their customers, because actually, there's a lot of brands have got that wrong over the pandemic, and it's fascinating that a lot of the time, if you leave an apology email to be written, sometimes when the lawyers get their hands on it, it can come out sign a little bit kind of inhuman in some ways. So actually teaching clients the principles of actually here's, if you're going to be sorry, be genuinely sorry, and here's reciprocity, and here's how to use the different nudges to actually make that more an effective piece of comms. So there's a whole kind of teaching and educating and showing people how it can apply, and then there's the kind of how do you take those principles and measure it. So measuring people on the change curve, so the classic trans-theoretical model of behavior change that just rolls off the tongue that everyone loves, but is one of those areas that if you start to understand how open people are to change, and then the nudges, and then you can start to measure which combination of nudges is going to work well at different points in the customer journey. So it's opening up more possibilities to kind of be smarter about where you can kind of use your messages, but also how you need to kind of capture that within the kind of research kind of tools and apparatus we have.
How has that affected sort of historical, if you like, tools like focus groups and things like that? This idea that actually, reading an interesting book recently, and it talks about the idea of focus groups is almost more about paying attention to how people say things and what they don't say and the way that their body language, rather than the kind of audio stuff or the verbal stuff, which is more sort of post-rationalization system two affected by other people around them type stuff. So does it affect that older techniques, and has it also unlocked newer things, newer techniques, or newer styles of research that you kind of bring to market?
Yeah, so I think with all of that, I think the challenge is always to overlay it into all the kind of what we do, because the traditional techniques aren't broken in any ways, but there's ways we can improve on them and kind of get a better understanding. And some of that is like finding the right exercises to get respondents to go through, whether that's the classic card sorting exercises in qual, but you can apply behavioral science thinking to kind of, well, how do you make sure you're framing them in the right way, or how do you make sure that you're kind of making it easy to answer the questions? So even within quant surveys, one of the things, if you're asking someone a question of what did you do like in the last 4 weeks, you might get a very different response if you ask them what did you do in the month of April, when people are able to frame it differently. So there's ways you can apply it just simply to the questions you ask to make sure you're not leading them. But the way we can kind of evolve that as well is when you think about, there's so many tools and techniques that the research industry uses. So one of those is a classic conjoint, where you're asking people to make trade-offs and choices of, that might be products and different prices. But again, if you look at that through a behavioral science lens, you can start to think, well, how do you frame it in the right context of the right shopper mission so that you're going to get more accurate responses? So we did an experiment not too long ago where actually we were looking at how do you test winter drinks in the middle of summer when no one's in the right mindset. So you think about putting them in the mindset in order to answer the question to show where people will pick the right choices. So I think there's ways you can start applying that thinking, and where it gets really kind of added layers on top of that as well is when you start to look at things like where you apply some of the neuroscience techniques. So implicit reaction time testing means you can also measure the level of conviction and the extent that people are they might say one thing, but actually do they genuinely believe that, and does that apply
Can
to
you
the brand?
explain that a little bit more? What that reaction time, what that shows, and how it works, please?
So it's a technique that comes from the kind of the world of neuroscience, where essentially it's a system 1 and system 2 thinking, where essentially if you are associating something really quickly in the brain, it tells us that there's a subconscious kind of belief behind that. So actually we use a reaction time technique which essentially measures the speed of response that people say they agree to different statements, or whether they think brands are a good fit to certain things, or whether they're likely to buy a certain product or service. And by calibrating that and kind of using the speed they answer, we're able to determine the extent that actually, they say it and they genuinely believe it, or actually are they just saying yes because it's one of those hygiene factors that they think they're expected to say yes. So when we apply those kind of techniques, actually we start to get a whole new world where we can say, the classic thing of like brands are obsessed with NPS, but actually everyone always kind of uses NPS. We've got clients that have a bonus on their NPS, but do they really understand who genuinely is recommending that brand and how they feel about that and how to shift that?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because NPS is one of those things that has sort of seeped into the collective consciousness of marketing because it's simple. It's a number, and there's a simplicity around it. But I think we were having corresponding before this interview that it's not as simple as that. That just somebody putting 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 doesn't make them a promoter. Do you think NPS is one of those things that probably a little bit? Is it overused or is it misunderstood or both?
I think it's not well understood in the sense of NPS is as good a metric as customer satisfaction or kind of customer effort in some ways, and I think you're always going to need some kind of measure for a business to understand an overall performance, and NPS is a good measure to do that. The problem becomes when it becomes oversimplified and almost isn't properly understood. So you often get businesses that'll be like, well, our NPS has gone down, but our sales are flat, and you kind of like, you need to understand the link between the measure and actually the impact on the business metrics in terms of sales and how that corresponds to actually people's experience in real life. But then you also need to understand then, once you've proven that link back to people's behavior, how do you actually change that NPS? Because if you're bonused on that, you're going to want to make sure that it goes up. So that could be the difference from changing someone from a 6 to a 7 or an 8 to a 9. It'll have a big impact, but how you do that, you need to understand, that level of conviction behind the experience, what they think of the brand, and all those dynamics around the market and decision making need to kind of come into play. So I think it's more around kind of making sure if you're going to use a metric, you understand it, and then that's where you can kind of create the strategy to change it.
It's always been an interesting one, NPS. I mean, especially being bonused on it, and I think it's funny. I worked on a big bank in Australia, Westpac, and banks, with the exception of like First Direct or maybe smaller challenger banks, always tend to have negative NPS, and they're almost impossible to move. So you kind of think, well, why am I even looking at this anymore? If I can't move it, then what's the
But most of those
point in
customers will
having
probably
it?
stay with that bank anyway.
Yeah, because it's inertia because of people moving banks is a pain in the ass, isn't it? So obviously, NPS talks about its technique. Are there any other techniques that you think are either A, sort of overplayed or overused or less useful than people think, versus techniques, maybe some new ones that you come across that you think are underplayed or deserve their moment in the sun and don't get used as much as you would like?
So I think, to be fair, I'm quite a pragmatist, and all research techniques are going to have some kind of clear value, and research done well, regardless of the approach, is going to give some guidance and direction from the client. So in that sense, there's nothing that you kind of would be massively overused or underused in that sense, because clients have to kind of work with the budgets they've got. But there are some factors you see that sometimes there's often an over reliance on kind of quite simplistic drivers analysis to try and explain behavior or to kind of set the kind of focus for strategy moving forward. So again, all of those techniques are good in their own right, but actually it's how do you kind of make sure that they're used in the right way or kind of blended with other approaches. So I think where we see some of the challenges come through is often where there's still times when as we know from human behavior, people aren't always good predictors of their own behavior, or people will struggle to remember certain things, and yet there's still a reliance on traditional ways of asking questions or doing focus groups on qual, when actually the better way would be to augment that with kind of where neuroscience might come in more to actually get more of that measurement that people can't easily articulate, or where you might actually do more behavioral tracking in some way to say, well, actually, this is what they're saying, but then this is the reality of how they're behaving in, might be, in the aisles of a supermarket, or it might be their kind of digital search history. Actually, all of them offer us a much more better insight to combine with those kind of traditional routes, so that we can address some of that overclaim. We can understand where people might say one thing and mean something else, or we had some great examples where we did some projects where we used some passive metering, and we actually followed them on a journey when they were buying a vacuum cleaner for a month. And they would never admit to us that they were basically going and looking at YouTube and watching unboxing videos of vacuum cleaners, but we were able to find that because we tracked their behavior and we were able to kind of understand then that journey and where it fit in.
Do you find that it's easier if you have some sort of quote unquote hard science to back up or to reinforce what is coming out of your research, that people are more likely to buy that the confirmation bias isn't as strong?
Yeah, I think that we're always a believer at one that we have to kind of be led by the science. I mean, there's an art to it and then there's a science, but actually, the techniques we have are providing us a way to bring that science to life and add that extra level on top of what we know. Market research is based on kind of consumer opinion and what they think.
Mm-hmm.
So actually being able to put some science behind that to say, well, if we're trying to work out to say, well, here's a new product or a new service and X number of people have said they're going to buy it, how can we put a level of conviction behind that to say for certain, actually, you need to plan your business for this amount of sales based on the fact that we know there's so much overclaim. We know that actually, in real life, all these other things get in the way and, your performance will be depending on all these other factors. So I think having the science behind that helps kind of clients feel reassured and helps give a bit more accuracy to make the right decisions as well.
Yeah. You made an interesting point about the combination of data science analytics going alongside market research. And interestingly, game is one of the few places I've worked where the market research team and the insight, data science analytics team sit in the same spot and are part of the same team because they're both hugely important in generating insight. True insights, what the customer's going to do. Do you see that's changing? Do you see that actually people are starting to bring together research and analytics and those kind of things? Or do you still see it as separate? Do people still sort of treat them as separate entities?
I think it massively depends on some of the clients as well, because I've spoken to research departments in the past that were very traditional market research and suddenly have retrained to all become data scientists as well. And we know clients are investing a lot of time and resource internally to kind of bring together that data science skill set. I'm quite lucky that one of the other divisions I work with within the Unlimited group is a data science experts, and actually they are able to provide a piece of the puzzle that market research alone can't do. So actually bringing them together is incredibly powerful, but trying to do that in a way, I suppose, it seems one of those kind of market challenges at the moment that some clients are kind of going so far down a route to develop their data science capabilities, but then sometimes it feels like they're missing some of the why behind that, and it's not fully joining the market research with that data science. So it feels like we're in the midst of a journey where there's a lot of data science is becoming a lot more important, and I think one of your conversations you were having recently as well with one of your other guests around the kind of the power of the different tools that clients have available now, but they're not necessarily utilizing all of those as well. So it just feels a bit like the tools are there, but it's not fully being joined up yet and utilized in a way that kind of thinks about the whole insight journey rather than still quite siloed.
Yeah, that's true. When we used to work together, we had conversations about, I can get a lot of hows and whats and some new, some real detail about what people are actually doing, but why they're doing it. That's why I need you guys, back in the day when we were working together. And I think I've always found it odd that they're so, in most places I've been, they're so separate. It just seems really peculiar to me. So we've talked about neuroscience and behavioral science. From your perspective, what's the kind of evolution? Like, where do you see this taking market research into the future? Are there any kind of techniques or things that are coming over the horizon that really excite you, or what's your sort of perspective on where research is kind of heading?
I think it's all quite exciting at the moment. Bear in mind, there's so many things going on at the moment. There's technology that's being developed means that actually neuroscience is becoming more accessible than before. So the likes of Dragonfly AI are kind of developing the technology there to help kind of answer a whole thing about how the human eye works and how the human brain will absorb information. So
and if you'd like to listen to a podcast about that, We have one of those.
Indeed.
With the lovely Mark Bainbridge. So if you want to listen to he's the co-founder of Dragonfly, so go back and listen to that one. Sorry, just thought I'd sneak that one in, Chris. Didn't mean to interrupt your flow there.
So we often kind of work with kind of tech providers, so like facial coding platforms. There's quite a few of those have developed now, and actually they're providing access to be able to quickly test comms and get this kind of level of neuroscience that's quick and accessible. So all of that kind of technology is kind of there. We know that clients can, they've probably got Qualtrics. A lot of them can run their own surveys, and they'll have a lot of big data to play with. I think that where the industry seems to be going is actually the tools are all there, but it still needs that kind of expertise to bring together where the behavioral science meets the expertise of neuroscience and that traditional skill set of just insight of being able to bring it together. So for me, that's the part that I find quite exciting, being able to kind of blend those different parts across the whole kind of journey, whether that's exploring the whole reason why consumers are doing certain thing, why they're shopping in a certain way, to helping the research actually genuinely inform the strategy. So using behavioral science workshops to kind of feed that into their ongoing deployment and comms plans. And then actually, we can do a lot more now in terms of like testing, kind of test and learn. So when you do come up with these strategies, that's where the databases, the CRMs can come in to help understand what works and what doesn't work. So I think the future feels more blended in being able to kind of bring that together, and that's where it is quite exciting because we can do some more interesting things. But as with all these things, I think it's still all dependent on, I suppose, clients kind of being curious in that way and wanting to take some of those risks to experiment.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think some of those brand trackers that have been around for and it's important to have longitudinal data that you can look back on and see trends and changes and all those things. Don't get me wrong. But I think you're right. A lot of people are kind of stuck with the kind of regular, let's just keep doing the brand tracker every quarter or every half a year, whatever it is. And let's, I just feel like you're right. There's a bit more out there in terms of different techniques that people should be asking questions about from their research partners. So no, it is really exciting. Well, at the end of pretty much most of the interviews, we do allow what we call a shill section, which basically is for the guests to kind of talk about the company they work for or something that's really interesting or how they can get in touch. So, Chris, this is your free advertising section. What would you like to shill?
Cool. Well, I think, for me, basically, it's all about promoting good insight, and the way that there's all sorts of this exciting tools and techniques that we're kind of working on at the moment, and I think that's, for me, it's one of those things where I think it's being inquisitive and kind of finding new solutions to some of these challenges. So I suppose my shout out to the world is really to say, well, if clients out there want to learn more about some of these techniques and technology and how we can blend all these together, to kind of drop me a line and start a conversation. And we often run kind of workshops to kind of help kind of, I suppose, prove the power of some of the science behind this and kind of help find accessible ways to kind of bring this to life as well. So I think if people are interested in finding out more, then please do get in touch.
Brilliant. We will leave Walnut's details in the show notes so you can find it there. Chris, thank you very much for coming on and spending time with us today. It's much appreciated.
No problem. Thank you very much.
Well, you did it. You've wasted another perfectly good half an hour or so with Rob and Jen and the Everybody Hates Your Brand podcast. Again, you can find us on everybodyhatesyourbrand.com and your podcast platform of choice. Have a week.
Take great care and be vigilant.